Welcome. I'm Sandja Brügmann, your host. This is New Global Mind, where we explore pathways for brighter futures through leadership and business. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Today's guest is John Fullerton, and I look forward to sharing this talk with you. Founder and CEO of Capital Institute. He's an American economist, investor, and a previous international career at JP Morgan. And as an astute viewer, if you're watching this, you will see I look just slightly different glasses, different clothing, because John and I actually got on a call a couple of months ago on a Sunday. Thank you, John, for taking your Sunday morning with me. And I didn't record the intro outro. So as the recording is going live today and I'm at the same location where we recorded the podcast, I realized I hadn't brought the same clothing with me. So just the small nuances of rolling with it and having joy with how life is showing up. And it not being perfect, releasing that need for perfection. Not that I'm super good at that myself, getting practice. So John has written the booklet, Regenerative Capitalism, How Universal Patterns and Principles Will Shape the New Economy. John, welcome. It is a true pleasure to have you here with us today and to share your wisdom and expertise.
My pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. It's a big and also urgent topic to delve into. How do we create an economic and finance model and service to life?
Well, you got 20 years. That's turned out to be the question I'm pursuing. And maybe just to start us off, what I would share, despite spending 20 years in the belly of the beast, and I think this is still true, even though we're now wrestling with what we're calling the Polycrisis, the people who are kind of the brain trust of our economic system design are working from a Newtonian mechanistic optimize the machine mindset. And so we're trying to problem solve all of these crises, but we'll never problem solve without first shifting. In a sense, it's a worldview shift to understand, the premise of my work is the economy is not a machine, it's a living system. And there is a science of living systems. It's called living system science. And we've learned an awful lot about living systems in the past 50 years that we didn't know before that. But economics as a discipline and business management as a discipline all predated the emergence of, we could simplify and just call it ecology, but it's a much more sophisticated understanding of how living systems from the microscopic right up to the planet itself, and cosmologists believe the entire universe, actually work. So it's a big transformation. And most of what we're doing to fight climate change or to fight inequality and everything in between are really chasing symptoms as opposed to root causes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I find in my work as well. You call it the polycrisis. Maybe just define just briefly what is the polycrisis for the listeners that might not have heard.
So it's I'm sure this is a meme that will continue to grow in our awareness. Interestingly, the meme made it to the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago, which some people would say put it on the map. But it's this idea that there are a series of crises that range from the climate crisis to the biodiversity, a series of ecological crises, biodiversity, climate, water, desertification. There's one that few of us spend enough time on, species loss. But then there's a whole other series of economic crises, inequality, accelerating inequality, and insecurity. I think particularly sitting in the United States, it's not as well recognized as different than inequality. It's related to it, but it's different. It evokes a very different emotional response, trauma response.
So are you saying financial insecurity?
Yeah. And increasingly financial insecurity, but it's linked to the climate issues. So, we just had these disastrous floods in Texas, and now there's no way that anyone who lives along a river feels the same way they did before a week ago. And so it's existential insecurity, but for sure financial insecurity. And then there's a sort of the rolling, I'll just call it a political crisis, the authoritarianism that's on the rise around the world or in many parts of the world, a loss in trust in institutions, political and otherwise. And then we can just go go on and on and on and list all these crises. And so rather than seeing them as individual unrelated crises, the concept of the polycrisis is that somehow they're connected. They're interconnected and interdependent, and one affects the other, like the example of the security I just mentioned. And then there's, the financial system, and everyone just feels in their bones that it's sort of, on the one level, the stock markets are at all-time highs, and the other level, it feels like the whole thing's about to collapse. And so it's a very unsettling feeling. And I actually like the phrase metacrisis better. That one is not as well recognized, but many people are promoting the idea that all of these crises of the polycrises are actually rooted in one single root cause, which is this idea of a myth of separation. The idea that I'm separate from you, I'm separate from the people with dark skin, and we're all separate from this thing we call nature. And it turns out none of that is true. That's a science, not an opinion. And yet it's literally dating back to the beginning of modernity in the Western cultures. We've been taught to think as separate parts, which gets right back to my first comment about our mechanistic, the parts approach to dealing with our problems, as opposed to a more holistic approach.
Yeah.
So it's all one thing, but it's a big thing.
In my work, I use metacrisis. That's how I'm seeing it and perceiving it.
Do you define it the same way or similar?
Well, that definitely resonates with me, how you defined it. And what I would add is, yes, it is an illusion of separation. But if we really go to the core of that, it is our consciousness. So the way that we overcome all the troubles that is on display in the world, all these environmental and social collapsing systems, it is inherently to do our consciousness work. That's what resonates. And
that resonates firmly with me. And I would say that the Cartesian, Newtonian, separate things into parts so we can understand them, that worldview arose out of a level of consciousness that was probably at the cutting edge at that time. In other words, it wasn't wrong. No. It's just that we need to continue developing and evolving, because there is truth. You can separate things into parts to understand the parts. The piece that haven't yet remembered literally, is that the sum of the parts add up to a whole that's far bigger than the sum of the parts. And we're stuck in that reconnection challenge.
Yes, exactly. We're at a global scale stuck in looking at the symptoms outside ourselves, because we see climate change, we see floods and droughts. We can count, in terms of biodiversity and species loss. So we see outside of ourselves the consequences, but we're only seeing the symptoms. So if we want to solve it, we need to get to the core of the actual problem.
And we sure do like to count.
Yes.
Easier to count than to self-reflect.
It sure is. It sure is. So what we're talking about is really a worldview level where we look outside ourselves and look at the problems and try to fix them from a mechanistic point of view, one by one. And from that view, switching to another worldview, another paradigm. And I saw on your website, you call it the integral age thinking. Is that correct? Is that one of the terms that you use?
I don't know what the right term is. That term, I think, accurately describes it, the reintegration of the so-called parts. But integral, it's become a word that's a bit loaded with meaning, some of which people don't love. So it's a bit of it's kind of like the word capitalism. You just say the word and you can trigger people.
Yeah.
And
I think also, when we're talking about words that are getting watered down or losing its real definition and meaning, regeneration is one of them. I find it really actually starting to not even use that word myself.
Really? Yeah. No, but it's a problem. It's interesting. There was a LinkedIn thread on this exact challenge where the provocation, I forget who started it, was essentially, we got to stop using our flowery words and blah, 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 and learn how to communicate to normal people, which of course I totally respect and understand. And yet there's also the words have meaning. And if regeneration means something specific, and the way I use it is what I've learned from living system scientists, it is the process that explains how life works. It's that simple and that profound, which is not just you stick on in the front of your PowerPoint when you're given a spiel. It's a profound idea. And there isn't, to my knowledge, a different word for it, unless you look to indigenous cultures where they would have a different way of describing it, but they're describing the same thing, but from an indigenous perspective, not a Western, quote unquote, modern science perspective. So on this LinkedIn thread, I ended up going back in and made a second comment. And I said, actually, I think our problem is not language as much as our inability to effectively communicate. And I've been very moved by the concept of dialogue. You know, in my version of a podcast, we call it a discovery dialogue. And I learned this from David Bohm, who explains that dialogue, by the way, for everyone who's interested, there's a brilliant short book, but it's an essay really called On Dialogue by David Bohm. And he essentially is saying, if we don't learn the skill of dialogue, which means you and I have a conversation and we both come out of the conversation learning something that neither of us knew coming into the conversation. So it's very generative.
Yeah. Developmental in that sense, yes.
And I actually think our problem is that we talk past each other because we each come into a conversation with our sort of set ideas on our worldview and our sense of right and wrong and morals and political identities and other identities. And we listen for ways to confirm our bias that, oh, you're one of those people who uses free language.
Yeah.
And we're not actually listening for what the person's trying to say. And then to compound it and make it harder, and you'll appreciate this given your work on consciousness, just because I say a bunch of words doesn't mean I have said words that mean what I'm actually thinking.
Absolutely.
So the challenge of communication is enormous.
Yeah.
It turns out if at a cellular level, living organisms don't communicate effectively, they die. So it's profoundly important that we get better at communication.
Yeah.
And I think this is where Nora Bateson's work on warm data comes in. It's essentially the way I think of it. I don't know if she would agree with this, but it's a little bit like hacking our brains to force us into a different level of communication that we're not accustomed to.
I think you touch on such a foundational challenge. Krishnamurti says that a boy is out experiencing a bird and can be with the bird without a concept. But the second you actually name it a bird, the boy no longer sees that bird.
Beautiful.
So it's also language is important to relate to each other to accomplish anything, but it's also, and it's a hindrance. And what's also interesting is we listen from the level of worldview, our level of consciousness. And for example, one of the big problems in terms of humanity's level of consciousness is psychological or an emotional immaturity. And if you talk to a person that's emotionally immature, you might have noticed that it can trigger something in yourself because there's not a resonance. Someone who's emotionally immature cannot connect with you, meaning your words will also not really land because there's a filter there that makes it impossible for them to take it in.
How do I know if it's not me that's the immature one?
Well, that's why it's important, which we talked about before we actually started the recording, that when we're doing this work and we are at that pioneering edge of trying to push what's possible for humanity, and we have those visions, we can see, you and I can see a little further than many people. And we're also some of the pioneers. We need to be able to bring that material, that learning, what we see to people, leaders, businesses, prizes, so forth, that might not yet see what we see, but we need to learn to communicate in a way that we can bring people along. That's at least for me, that's quite the challenge.
Yeah.
I need to really stretch myself to be able to talk into a different worldview. Because if
Yeah,
we
and
don't,
don't underestimate how challenging that is. Having spent 20 years on Wall Street, people assume, oh, this guy can talk to those people, and it turns out that's not the secret. I don't. I actually think, and we were talking again earlier about your intuitive. I hope you don't mind. I'll share with your listeners. I half jokingly, but half serious, but mostly seriously, described you as the board whisperer. But
that's
I
right.
think it's a feminine intuition that breaks through. It's a creative thing. It's a feminine thing. It's not a credibility with those people thing. Because when I start talking about regenerative economics, people's, particularly 5 years ago, less so today, but because people are, I think, scared and suddenly searching for some fresh perspectives. But the bridging thing is again more about a process than an identity or a expertise, is what I've learned. I used to think my purpose or my job was to kind of like a bit of a Paul Revere, oh, I know something now and I know people that need to know this. So my job is to warn people. And I gave up on that strategy a long time ago.
So
Um,
what is your strategy now?
um, well, to call it a strategy is probably overly sophisticated. Since I've been working on this problem, this transformation challenge. From the very beginning, I've been very moved by Dana Meadows' analysis. She wrote a paper initially, and there's now a book called Places to Intervene in a System.
Hmm.
And the punchline really was that there are all these different leverage points, things like data and feedback loops and buffers and goals even. But the powerful point was that the most important leverage point is the paradigm within which the system exists. And I've experienced that many times. I've gone in when Obama was president. I went into the Treasury Department and argued for a financial transaction tax from a living systems perspective. And we could go into it. It doesn't really matter. The details don't matter. The point is that it was sort of a mind-numbingly obvious, simple policy fix that was in the air because of the financial crisis and people making arguments pro and against. Arguably, the Obama Treasury Department would be sympathetic to my point of view. But the guy had no idea what I was talking about. And his worldview was that any tax is bad for efficiency, and efficiency is the key to growth. So why would you want to harm growth? Because growth is where our prosperity lies. And so you have to start at 50,000 feet in order to explain why a simple little financial transaction tax actually does something profoundly different, which is it discourages speculation. And speculation is by definition an extractive win-lose proposition when it's out of balance. But you can't have that conversation, getting back to our earlier conversation. You can't even have that conversation because that language is meaningless if you're not speaking from a shared worldview. I would say 80% of my effort for the last over a decade has been working on this paradigm shift. And Dana's point, after she turned the kind of quick and dirty essay into a proper paper, she said, oh, and there's one more leverage point that's the most important of all, more important than the paradigm. And that's our ability to let go of our paradigm because there's no right paradigm. And if I had to describe kind of what's unique about John in this challenge, is that I've been able to voluntarily let go of my paradigm, just intuitively. Like, in fact, I let it go before I even knew what I was doing by leaving Wall Street. In a sense, by walking out the door, I let go of my paradigm without thinking about letting go of my paradigm. And now what seems obvious to me strikes other people as, how did you ever do that? And I don't know the answer to that.
I was about to ask that question, but now you already said you don't have the answer to that because it is quite bold. You were successful on Wall Street in the finance industry, and then you decided to do something entirely different.
Yeah, but it wasn't even I decided. It was I had no choice. Like I could feel, and it wasn't because the next thing people assume is, oh, you must have had some kind of, you did something horrible and you confronted your ethics. It was nothing like that. I mean, it was long before the financial crisis. I mean, the old JP Morgan was, in the scheme of things, a highly ethical place to work. And we all had a wonderful, frankly, arrogant view on our place in the system. Many of us would never work in any other firm than Morgan because we thought it was the only truly prestigious, ethical, refined, we had a lot of self-importance, which is probably why we ended up getting bought by Chase. But it wasn't anything horrible. It was much more of I describe it as a little voice that wouldn't stop talking. And it several times over several years, and it showed up in strange places, like sitting on an airplane on Father's Day. And it was just again, a very intuitive, I guess you would say my consciousness, not my consciousness was speaking to me.
And you
And it
decided
took me
to
a
listen.
decade to figure out what it was really about, to be honest.
So that's now informing your work around reimagining the economics and finance system and service to life.
Yeah, there was no single epiphany really that led to that, but one of the very formative experiences, and a lot of people talk about the difference between intellectual knowledge and experiential knowledge, and I really, again, it's one of these both ends, not either ors. Like anything that matters, it's a paradox. But I did have an experiential learning that sits at the top of the formation of my thinking, and that was I got involved through my what we call now impact investing. This idea of trying to align social and environmental purpose with an investment project and a company. I got involved with a man named Alan Savory and a group called the Savory Institute. And their work is about regenerating the grasslands using holistic decision-making, holistic management. And it's a long story, but the gist of it is mimicking how the herbivores and wild in nature work symbiotically with the grasslands. And the grasslands are 2/3 of the land-based planet. So this is actually a really big deal in terms of desertification, first and foremost, but also climate change and biodiversity loss and water retention and soil health. And it occurred to me, literally standing on a ridge in Montana, looking over a couple 100,000 hectares of rolling grasslands, that if this approach to managing that system, that living system, the prairie, made sense and worked, and it clearly does. I saw it with my own eyes. I experienced it. I invested in it. So I care deeply to understand it. Then if the economy is a living system, and that's an interesting question, is it a living system? Then if this is how living systems work, it must apply to the economy, not just to the grasslands, or not just to a forest, or not just to my body as a human living system. It applies to every living system. And so then you have to start thinking, well, if the economy is a system, which it clearly is, it's either a living system or a dead system. And the fact that it still exists means it's a living system. But then you look at all of the symptoms of problems, it's clearly a very unhealthy system in the vast majority of the people. And this has nothing to do that are participating in it. And this has nothing to do with socialism versus capitalism, which of course is when you're in a worldview, the first reaction is, oh, you must be a socialist or you must be a communist. But that's just a limitation of imagination that those were the only two choices, which they clearly are not. And in fact, socialism is predicated on the same mechanistic logic as capitalism. It just optimizes and prioritizes different values. So I concluded, again, I think intuitively, but it seems to me self-evident truth that the economy needs to be a living system. If we care about sustainability, if we want the economy to continue, much less to thrive and create thrivability for humanity, it must be that we want it to be a living system. And it turns out we know a lot about living systems because there's a whole science that's been developed over the last 50 years. And so my whole life work now is this idea of first learning and understanding how living systems work, which is different than physics. It's not reducible to mathematical equations. It's more in the field. People talk about patterns and first principles. I talk a lot about first principles, things that you can reduce no further They're estimates of best a way we can describe, getting back to communication, truth as best we understand it. It's not truth, but it's our best understanding of truth. So something like working in right relationships, symbiotic relationships. Every sub part of our human body works in right relationship with the other parts, or we get sick and die. That symbiotic relationship exists on the grasslands between herbivores and the grass, and between the grass and the soil. And that pattern exists in all living systems. So it's a first principle. It's a pattern that is a first principle. And so my work is about discerning these first principles, and there's no right or wrong way to describe them, but there is an understanding that there are first principles, and then looking at the economy as it exists and diagnosing where it's in conflict with those first principles. Because if they're first principles, it's not an a la carte menu that's a choice. They're required to be in alignment, or the system is sick and ultimately dies. And final point, and this is the hopeful part, if we align with these patterns and principles, then the economy should be expected to achieve the same thing that all life achieves, which is manifesting unseen potential. And unseen potential is the source of our prosperity, not ever more material expansion of the material throughput, which is the premise of our old worldview. And so when we look at the polycrisis, and we look at climate, and we look at the debt, and we look at all these problems, and we limit ourselves to what we know and what we can see and what we can measure, getting back to we like to measure, then we're missing probably 99.999% of the possibilities that actually exist out there. And so if we can shift to a living systems worldview, then that possibility or that potential becomes real and not an abstraction, because it is as real as you sitting here. You were potential until your parents met. In fact, you were potential before your parents met. No one could have figured that out. But certainly once they met, before you were conceived, you were potential that became manifest. And you're influencing the world in a way that no one before you were born could have ever predicted in a spreadsheet. Same with Einstein. Same with Hitler. But this is true of all living systems. What they evolve into, including a company. A company is a living system. And so, Google, I remember when I first was given Google as a tool, I was like, yeah, this is really cool, but how are they ever going to make money? Well, Google manifested into something that's actually both very incredible and very dark. But no one could have imagined that before Google existed. So the same thing applies to individuals, to families, to couples, to communities, to cities, to corporations, and to the entire global economy.
So let's talk a little more about that. There's some interesting potential, and might also be a little more difficult to unpack. The darkness. So there is potential. Everything, so to speak, has potential. And now you mentioned two examples that have what you call some darkness to it. You mentioned Google and you mentioned Hitler. And in terms of a living systems perspective, can you put that into perspective? We don't really want a world. I think the majority of people don't want a world where a person like Hitler can manifest again. So how do we ensure that that doesn't happen? I mean, those are big questions, of course, but because it relates to the living systems perspective that we are talking about.
Yeah, no, it does. And it relates to consciousness.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
No, I mean, I'm just thinking about how to at least begin with a something concise, because I do have strong feelings about those questions. That they're slightly different, but they're related. Maybe let me start with Google first, because it's easier. And interestingly, remember Google had a slogan, something like "Do no harm" or "Cause no harm" or something when they first started.
Oh, I
Remember
didn't
that?
know that. That's
The founders had essentially "Do no evil," I think was the slogan.
Wow, interesting.
And I think they meant it. I mean, I genuinely believe that they meant it. And it's a brilliant case study, because even before you get to Google, you need the internet, right? Google is only possible because the internet manifested. So the real innovation was the internet. Google is just an app on the internet. And the internet, I describe in my course, is the most regenerative technology that I can think of that's emerged in my lifetime, for sure. And the reason for that is that one of the first principles of living systems is, in my language, robust circulation, or think of it as metabolism, healthy metabolism of a body, of a living organism. And that's where the circular economy fits within regenerative economics, but it's not limited to matter and energy, which is what the circular economy is about. So it's a bigger idea than just matter and energy. It's the circulation of information. And in fact, it's the circulation of emotion. Why do we use emojis? Because in one little image, you can communicate emotion. And so the internet has facilitated this robust circulation of not only, of information and emotion and probably consciousness, right? If you think about it as a collective system, it's accelerated exponentially the potential of a rising consciousness. I was in a quick digression. I was in a retreat once at a monastery, and they piped in some guy who was doing meditation practices over the internet. And we had all just come from participating in the morning prayer with the nuns at 7 a.m, which apparently all the Catholic nuns do all around the world and have done that for thousands of years without the internet. So it was kind of funny. But getting back to Google, so it's taken this incredible technology we call the internet, and it's provided an incredible tool we call search. And naive John, when he first used it, wondered how they ever going to make money. Well, it turns out the way they decided to make money is right out of the Silicon Valley playbook, which is extract and exploit and optimize in a way that probably not even the people that promoted that idea understood what would happen. And now it's this dark, advertising algorithms and addictive algorithms have become this incredibly dark, awful thing that is poisoning. It's not too strong to say poisoning the health of humanity, and particularly our kids. Yeah. So why did that happen? And how do we keep that from happening again? My response would be because we didn't honor first principles. Extractive advertising is not using your data. And even if you signed away in the fine print that something you didn't understand, that's not working in a right relationship, period, full stop. So we have a business model that's in conflict with living systems first principles, not John's ethics or your ethics or my ideology or anyone's politics, first principles of how life works. And we see the consequences. It's a perfect case study. Whereas if the business model had been, go to one extreme, a nonprofit, a billionaire dropped $1 billion to make it available to everyone, we'd have free Google search for no advertising. Another option would have been an annual subscription. And if we knew what we know now, we'd all be happy to pay $20 a year for search because that's all it would cost. Now, the founders of Google and the venture capitalists would have many billions less wealth, but other than they, who the hell cares? So we need to get back to first principles, would be my answer. And real quickly on the Hitler question, there's another dimension in this, was trauma. And you understand, sure, more about trauma than I do. But, when we do things that are evil and when we do things that are not constructive, forget about Hitler, just think about all the rest of us that screw up on a daily basis. Increasingly, my understanding is that you can track a lot of that to traumas we have, either fear or shame or whatever. And so, the other pathway out of this problem, and they're totally connected, is the collective rising consciousness. And a collective rising consciousness will enable us to see that we're part of one single unified living system. So these are all reinforcing things. And so that to me is the work. And yet we're reduced to measuring ESG and coming up with better goals, and CEOs setting out big, hairy, audacious goals that everyone knows they have no idea how to achieve, but that's considered heroic to do because that's our culture. Yeah. And now 20 years later, we realize that they're doing it good.
Yeah. Yeah. The measuring of ESG and so forth, the whole reporting aspect, comes from the mechanistic mindset.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's how most of business is conducted. It is from the linear, rational mind, which so interestingly is not very rational at all.
It can be rational. I mean, I'm often quick to, it's not a good, bad thing. It's
no, it's not a good, bad thing.
The way I was taught to think about this is that we need to use rational thinking when we're working on problems that are complicated. Like, what's the best design for an iPhone? Well, it turns out it looks like this.
Yeah.
And the more you work on it, the more you end up with something that looks like this. But when we're dealing with complexity, the left brain, competitive, analytical, rational fails because it
Mm.
can't see the system. It can't see the whole. And so we need our
Yeah.
right intuition. And
Yeah.
that's in business.
Yeah, which is interesting because it is our emotional intelligence, it is our relational intelligence. It's also business is conducted between individuals. So the whole relational aspect is absolutely so
Yeah.
important.
Getting back to
But
communication.
yeah, getting back to communication, yes. And it's not, I didn't mean to say that the rational aspect of
No, I
intelligence is
know.
not important.
Yeah.
It is. But when it's used from a mechanistic worldview, it's not rational because we, at that level of self-awareness, we actually have so many emotions and irrational thinking that runs our decision making, but we are not aware of it. So we think we're rational, but
Mm.
we're really not. So that's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
So the more we actually purify ourselves as a vehicle, if you would call it that, the more rational we can become.
Mm-hmm. And that's very much reflected in our economics, that there's a whole field called behavioral economics, which
Mm,
was what I would call patch to the flawed assumption that we're just money optimizing, utility maximizing machines. But rather than questioning the underlying mechanistic premise, bolted on a patch, which is no, we actually need to integrate psychology. Humans are more complicated than simply utility maximizing machines, but it's a patch that didn't actually deal with the root cause, which is interesting. And because we did the same thing with our understanding of astronomy for 1,000 years, we tried to patch the theory that everything rotated around the Earth with
mm,
theories to explain why the planets would reverse course. So that to me is the analogy of what we've done primarily in economics, as opposed to going back to the foundation, which is to see the economy as a living system, not a machine. But we
yeah,
invented economics in the wake of Newton. So of course we would have tried to apply Newton's thinking. It made total
thinking.
sense in that context.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
primary thinking at the time. So, I don't know if you worked in this area for quite a long time, and you also mentioned before we started the recording that you have a new book coming up. I look very much forward to reading that. When you look at the global stage at this point in time, what are you seeing? Do you see a movement towards a living systems understanding? And is it realistic? Is it realistic to create an economy that's based on living systems principles? And what does it take?
Well, I have so many thoughts on this. Like, I'm not a false optimist kind of a guy, but I am hopeful. I am hopeful. But I think I need to start with, rather than, oh yeah, it's going to be great. We're in deep shit, to quote
Mm,
Fuller 50 years ago again. We're on a knife's edge. And he
mm,
said that 50 years ago. And, particularly what I see unfolding in the United States, just on the pure, we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but it is clearly put the truck in reverse and hit the gas as hard as you can. And we're just doing everything wrong in so
yeah,
many ways. And yet it's also highlighting many of the problems that we've ignored. And so just as one example, and so part of my hope is based on a belief that we collectively, and particularly we in the United States, as sort of the champion of the extractive capitalist system, European versions of the capitalist system are not as extreme and not as extractive, despite Wall Street's best efforts to make them that way. And there are examples for example, in Japan of much more businesses that are much more aligned with what I would call regenerative economics. The big global trading houses manage themselves as an ecosystem. So part of my answer to your question is that the regenerative economy is here. It's just hidden. The internet is the regenerative economy. And in fact, every time people ask me for examples of it, I always hesitate. It goes right back to your Christian Murdoch bird thing.
mhm,
If I give you 5 examples of the regenerative economy, then I've shut down your imagination for what 5 million examples that are hidden out there in plain sight might be, because you'll look past them because you're now looking for another example of the bird.
mm,
So I actually hesitate to give people examples, but rather try to persuade them to live into and learn and then live into and learn to see through these regenerative lens, the first principles and patterns. Because once you do that, and I've got a decade now plus of doing this, I promise you, I see the regenerative economy all over the place, from a farmer's market to the internet to the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. It's probably the large scale example. It's, billions of annual turnover of 80 businesses, billions of annual turnover, I think 20 billion, but I may have the number wrong. And yet they manage it as a single healthy ecosystem. And the purpose is legacy, not billionaires. And so my hope is that it's rested on two things. One, this isn't up to a bunch of smart human beings to figure this out and then go execute as if it was a McKinsey.
Yeah.
This is actually the natural evolution of our human economy. And what causes any living system to change is pressure. And so we're under pressure. The heat is on, literally and figuratively. And I see what Trump is doing as just the universe. I mean this literally. The universe we now believe is intelligent. And so the universe has delivered us exactly the medicine we need because we're not paying attention. And I wrote about that in Trump 1:16. I wrote a blog called Trump: a gift. And we didn't get the message.
No.
So we'll get to go around the track again, and much worse. And so the more these things happen, the higher the probability that that the system will shift. And then the question is, does it shift in a good way or a bad way? And I don't know the answer to that. It's the same Google problem. But I'm working every day of my life to try to promote this idea that if we get clear on how life works, if we educate ourselves on how life works, if we re-educate ourselves, because most of us, the allegory of Plato's cave is so appropriate. We live in a false worldview of separation, getting back to the beginning of our conversation. And so I don't know anything more important than to try to new view, which I see as, the natural evolution of, and we went from the medieval age to the modern age. And this is the next evolution this is a big change in era. This is way bigger than, the Industrial Revolution or the information revolution. This is shifting from modernity to something that future historians will call something. They didn't call it the scientific revolution. They didn't call it the Renaissance. I don't know about the scientific revolution. People lived in the Renaissance for hundreds of years before they knew it was called the Renaissance. So we're living in the whatever right now. And future historians are going to call it something. And, we talked about, is it the integral age? I don't know. My colleague, Jude Caravan, who's brilliant, uses the phrase unitive age, which I like because the amazing thing about this is our latest science is actually reconnecting with the intuition that our ancient wisdom traditions somehow understood. So we've again gone full circle and remembered or unified with what we've always known.
And also back to our conversation around polycrisis, metacrisis, and so forth, the illusion of separation. And of course, unitive speaks to the overcoming of that or the transcendence of that.
Exactly. I wonder who coined Renaissance. I think it means literally reborn. There are thoughtful people referring to this as the new Renaissance, but rather than it being European, it's global, and it's drawing on global wisdom, not just some European, ideas. But it is a Renaissance. I mean, it's a death and a birth for sure, whatever it ends up being called. And deaths are not without a lot of pain and suffering. And so it's not a kumbaya story that we're talking about. But, actually, I didn't respond. I wanted to say one thing. My strategy for this is it actually has a few different parts. And I think it's worth sharing because I do believe it's hopeful. And it's easy to get despondent in this moment. So the first piece of it is what I already talked about, Dana Meadows' paradigms. So we need to recognize we're all in a game of figuring out how to change paradigms. And we don't really know how to do that. But if you read Dana's paper, she gives you ideas. It's essentially continuously poking at the old paradigm and pointing out that it's failing and that it's not true, and then offering an alternative. So we need to all be doing that. We need to be thinking about it, whether we're teaching math in third grade or working on the electrical outlets or running a country. We all need to be practicing living into this new paradigm. The second thing is this idea of Prigogine, who was a Nobel chemist, and I'm sure you're familiar with this expression. When a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can change the whole system or can shift the whole system. And so I think building these islands of coherence and connecting them is the strategy, rather than thinking you're going to influence a quote leader, and a leader has the power to change anything on their own. If you're the CEO of Unilever, it turns out you can't change the system, even if you try as hard as you can for a decade. We need to recognize that we need to be part of an island of coherence, and that can be as small as our, book club in our community, or as big as a multinational corporation, or as big as an industry within the global economy. But chances are leaders are going to follow that, not lead that. And then the final piece, and this relates again directly to your work, so I'm sure this will resonate. Have you ever run into Monica Sharma and her work?
No.
She is a force of nature. She worked at the UN most of her career, and people give her credit for solving the AIDS crisis. So she's got a pretty decent resume.
That's significant. Yeah.
I don't know if it's true, but she would, I'm sure, deny it. But it is what people say about her work at the UN. And so she's talked a lot about and has written books about how to change a system or how to change the world. And she has a very simple diagram of 3 concentric circles. And so, I'm probably going to butcher this, but the idea is, I think, correct. The outer circle, think of that as all the problems we all work on day in and day out, whether we're a CEO of a company or a government official or a nurse, we're working on problems. That's what we do. And that's good. It's important we do that. But if that's all we do, we're often working on symptoms rather than root causes. And then the inner circle is the consciousness work. So the Dalai Lama, a monk, meditating all day, thinking that what we need to do is raise consciousness, and then the problems are a result of our level of consciousness. And that work's important to do, but on its own is unlikely to change the world, according to Monica. And then she says there's this third layer between those two, which is the system. And in reality, the system, whether it's the food system, the transportation system, or the global economic system, or the financial system, the system is actually the product of the level of consciousness that created it. And the system design is perfectly designed to create all the problems that we're working on. So her point is, if you want to change the world, you actually have to work across all 3 of those at the same time. You can't just sit on the mountain as a monk. You can't just work on the problems, and you can't just sit at MIT writing papers on system science. You actually have to work on all 3 at the same time. And so that's the third part of my strategy, which I wouldn't call a strategy. I would call it a best shot.
Fiction. That's wonderful. One of the things that I'm coming back to is bringing more joy and fulfillment into my work. I mean, I've always been fulfilled by my work, but I want to, because it can easily become very serious. It's some very serious challenges we are up against. So for me, trying to also approach it in a more balanced way, and not the bypassing the actual what's really here and just be positive. Yeah. That's not what I mean, but allowing ourselves to be present, which is a miracle. We're present, we're alive right now, to also really honor and enjoy that. And I also find that the more islands of coherence, the more people I connect with that resonate, where we can co-create that almost spontaneous kind of resonance. Is it a level of passion, a level of gratitude that comes from those connections? And I think that fuel is so important to take with us in this very important work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I've struggled to learn that lesson myself. You mentioned Krishnamurti earlier. So funny. Synchronicity. So I was just reflecting on another thread that I was a part of. He was some meeting that he held, and he essentially criticized people for being so obsessed with the search. And the message was, stop searching and then you'll find what you're looking for. And there's something, and I'm probably not explaining it well, but there's something about actually turning this struggle into the whole point. Like, this isn't like I would rather be playing golf, but I have to do this because the world's imploding. This is actually the source of my meaning and purpose, which gives me joy. And
Yeah.
I mentioned, I've literally just completed this book, which the first draft of it, or the first edition of it, was really the paper I wrote literally 10 years ago. And the joy it's given me to complete that and see it come back to me in the form of a book, not a Word document, is to me why I'm here. And that's way more enjoyable to me than playing golf. I don't play golf, but that's just a metaphor. So yeah, I think we have to accept that this is why we're here right now. And that's a privilege, not a burden. And I if I'd said that 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it, but today I believe that.
And I think what you're saying about stopping the search, I just wrote an article that's about to be published, and there's some principles that I'm outlining. And as we're doing this work, we ourselves understand more and more and can more clearly formulate and communicate, right? But the first principle is to surrender, to stop the search.
Yeah. Yeah.
To conclude our wonderful talk here together, which is so inspiring, and I thank you so much for taking time here on a Sunday.
Sunday special.
Sundays. Are there any concluding words that you would like to share?
Stop thinking and just allow things to happen. It turns out we find stuff we didn't know we were looking for. But if I were CEO of a big company right now, I think what it takes to be a leader in this, leading a company that's very much embedded, particularly if it's a public company that's trapped in the old paradigm while trying to transform it, when we know that no single company can do it. What I can tell you is you can become a regenerative company no matter how challenging the external context is, by the way you learn to work and treat each other and how you make decisions. I could make Exxon a much more regenerative company if they wanted to, without changing their business model. It wouldn't make them a regenerative company, but the way they make decisions internally and the way people feel when they show up for work and what they therefore contribute, there's all kinds of things that can be done, and we're doing that. And so it's to me, it's a hopeful message that no matter where we are in this transformation, the way we lead, the way we manage, the way we make decisions can be shifted. And if my thesis is right, that will create potential that no one knows in advance. And that's progress.
That's a beautiful. Thank you so much for showing up. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandja, for inviting me. Pleasure to be with you on your island in Denmark. Next time I want to see the real thing.
Absolutely. You're welcome anytime. You have listened to New Global Mind, Leadership for Systems Transformation. I'm your host, Sandja Brügmann, and you can find this on all your podcast channels, YouTube, and our website, thepassioninstitute.com. See you next time.